Good morning, everyone. Reginald Scott here, and today we're going to be reviewing the Nemo Tig. I'm on my way up to the beach, my favorite beach in Brunei, the Barakas Nature Reserve or National Park. We're going to park up the bike, get out of this noisy traffic area, and I'm going to begin the video. So stay tuned if you want to know about the Cinelli Nemo Tig, the modern steel bike. The steel bike for the modern age. Alright. Wearing my nicest jersey today, just for you. Look at it. Sweet. Alright, let's go make a video. Oh man, I just want to show you this location. This is the entrance into the park. Isn't it beautiful? Look at that. And this is before you get to the beach anyway. I'm doing this one-handed, so I'm going to put the camera away in a minute before I crash. Isn't that lovely? Welcome to my favorite beach in Brunei. There you see the South China Sea. If you look off into the distance, you might even be able to spot an oil rig. The Cinelli Nemo Tig. Before we begin, I've got a confession to make. I've actually not been looking forward to making this review. Today, I'm actually going to criticize this bike. I'm going to criticize this particular steel bike. And it doesn't mean that I don't think steel bikes are good, because I do. I did not fall in love with this bike. In 6 months of riding it, I did not fall in love with it. And for me, that's weird, because I love every single one of my bikes. To put it in perspective, this bike here costs around 3.3 thousand Brunei dollars for just the frame and the fork. And you get a few little bits as well. The headset, for example, comes with it. Let's have a little closer look at the headset. And you also get a derailleur adapter, which I didn't use. And that's pretty much it. Oh, you get a cleaning rag as well. 3.3 thousand for a frame set. And built up in the way you're seeing it today, it's around $6,000, and I'll stick the total estimated price below in GBP and USD as well. It's not a cheap bike by any stretch of the imagination. As much as it hurts me to say, because I stand here today in this beautiful place with this beautiful looking bike, and you cannot deny that this is a beautiful looking bike. If I had my time over again and I had my money again, I would seriously consider not buying this bike, not buying this frame set. So, to start off with, as I was saying before, this is a beautiful bike. And I don't think there can be any argument that it is not a beautiful bike. It is a classical piece of art. The lines, the shape, the variety of colors you can get this bike in, including the one I have it in, which is this gorgeous yellow moon color, is undeniably aesthetically pleasing. Irrelevant of whether you happen to prefer thick tubed carbon frames or spindly aluminium frames or steel frames, there is, in my opinion, absolutely no foundation for the argument that this is not a beautiful bike. It is. It's just pretty. It's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. And I've never had so many compliments about my bike than when I ride the Nemo. People who have never complimented one of my bikes before, even the bikes I feel more passionate about than the Nemo, they have stopped and they have said, wow, that's a really nice bike. And one thing people absolutely love is the color. And alongside the beauty of this frame, another positive about this bike is that it is Italian made. And I think that really counts for something today. I really do. Because in the age where 99% of the bikes you see on the road right now are made in China or Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Taiwan, like I say, People's Republic of China, it's nice. It's a breath of fresh air. It's something special to have a bike made in Italy, an Italian bike made in Italy. And I know that it's something special because so many foreign brands, so many Chinese brands, pretend to be Italian, or they say designed in Italy, which probably meant that somebody from the factory took a short holiday to Italy, sat in the hotel room with a laptop, and tweaked the design slightly so that they could put on the advertisement or the marketing designed in Italy, which virtually means nothing. But this was designed in Italy. It was made at the Columbus factory. So it is something special. And you can feel that. And it does make you proud to own it. I feel more proud to own this than I would a Cinelli bike made of carbon fiber, made in Taiwan. Going back to the positives of this bike, I have to talk about probably the biggest positive of this bike, the handling. The design of the fork here, the design of the fork and the front end of the bike, the geometry is very similar to a Giant TCR. And that's really noticeable when you get in the corners, when you have to avoid a speed pothole or a bump in the road, or when you're racing. And I'm going to insert some clips here and talk a little bit more about the handling and the controllability of the bike.
Here's an example of me going around a hairpin bend on the Nemo. Very easy. You can see in the next one, I nailed it really nicely. I'm not going terribly fast, but the bike just handles very, very well. Coming down this hill here, around 60 plus kilometers an hour, there's a little bit of a snake at the bottom, as in a bend. And again, the bike just handles it beautifully well, no fuss. Moving on to the next little example. I don't have many examples of cornering on this bike, but here's just a little mini roundabout I need to navigate, and scrub a little bit of speed and just smoothly round. It's very nice. I'm going to give you an example now of during the race. If you watch the guy with the black stripe down his blue jersey and white bicycle on my left, just watch the line that he takes and the line I take on the corner. Everyone was kind of shocked by this corner, and quite a few people misjudged it on the first time around. But let's have a look at that again in slow motion. You'll notice, as I say, my position, his position. I hold my line quite well going around the corner, and you'll notice that he's an experienced rider, by the way, experienced racer as well, and he just loses it on the corner there, and he has to come right across, cutting in front of me. Wasn't too much of a problem for me. I was able to control it nice and easily and get around the corner. So there you go, just a few examples of how easy it is to ride the Nemo and corner on the Nemo. If you're a good rider, I'm not saying that I am, but if you're a good rider, you'll find this a very enjoyable bike to corner on for sure.
This bike wants to turn. It is a little unstable, a bit like a jet fighter, and for sort of fast-paced maneuverability, that is excellent. In a racing context, or in a fast-paced dodging cars or city traffic context, or just avoiding those potholes, this bike is phenomenally good at handling. They got it spot on. Coming to speed of the bike, this bike holds its speed very, very well, especially when you stick deep section carbon wheels on it, of course. But for whatever reason, when you get this thing up to speed, it holds its speed well. It just cruises nicely. I was coming here to the beach and I was maintaining high 30s, 38, 40 kilometers an hour without really any serious trouble on the flats. And coming back to the construction of the bike, and especially because this one is rim brake, which is my preference, the bike is not only strong, confidence inspiring because of that strength, but it's beautifully simple. The cabling is simple. It's easy to service. It has a threaded bottom bracket, which makes things very simple indeed. My only criticism of the threaded bottom bracket is, of course, that they coat the inside of the frame with a certain level of paint or protection to prevent the frame from rusting on the inside, and they used a little bit too much in the threads, and so I would recommend you using a wire brush when you fit the bottom bracket, because it is a little bit difficult to do. But yeah, you will need to clean those threads out a little bit to get your BB in. But once it's in, once you got it fitted, it's not a problem, and it's very easy to remove and replace. And there is actually, underneath the BB shell down here, behind the cable guide, there is a hole for water to drain out of the shell. So you don't have to worry about that. There's also vents in the frame behind the dropouts here. There's like a small hole in the back. So the inside of the frame does keep dry, and it is easy to drain the bike after washing or after a rainy ride, so that is good. And because it's such a high quality steel as well, rust is really not a problem with this bike. It's not something you need to terribly worry about. And as long as you keep the frame covered with paint, if you do chip the frame or anything like that, just go over it with a little bit of nail varnish or something in a color that matches the frame, or in clear coat if you just want to protect it, and you'll be absolutely fine. There's really nothing to worry about. You would have to seriously abuse this bike, and I mean seriously abuse it, like I'm talking drop it in the sea, before you'd have to worry about rusting. So don't worry about that if you are considering buying a modern steel bike. And finally, something that you can't really quantify, it's not something that you can explain in any other way than a feeling, but I forgive the cliche, but this bike feels real. It feels real. Sometimes when you ride a carbon bike or even some aluminium bikes, they just feel a little bit cheap, a little bit, I don't know, empty. When you ride this bike, it feels real. It really does. It doesn't feel transient or fake. It feels like something that's going to be with you and last. And that's a lovely feeling. So those are my positives about the bike. Here we go with some of the negatives of this bike. I was actually quite shocked. It was not what I was expecting, I must admit. So first, let's get to the paint. The paint is beautiful on this bike. I love the color. The finish looks delightful. However, this bike's paint seems way softer than it should be. It marks really easily. Honestly, I'm babying the frame. I have to baby this frame because I'm so petrified of scratching the paint. I've already suffered quite a few serious paint scratches on the inside of the fork from dirt and stuff flying up from the road. But most importantly, and you probably won't be able to see this very easily because it is difficult, but underneath the frame here where I hung the bike originally, after I took it down from the wall and it was just the frame that I hung, there was dents in the frame. And this was dents in the paint where the paint had moved and sort of pressed out. And this was hanging on rubber hooks on the wall, which are like this thick. I can show you them. But just sitting there on the wall actually push the paint out of place. And you can actually feel those sort of divots in the frame. So the paint is really soft. Alright folks, let me show you how I hang bikes in the store and also how I hang my own personal bikes, and then show you what I need to do in order to prevent damage to the Nemo's frame with that soft paint. Let's take a look. So this is how I hang most of my bikes. I use shelving supports. These are aluminium shelving supports. And then what I do is I wrap them in rubber tubing from the bicycle tubes. So these are butyl tubes. So I just wrap them like bar tape basically around the aluminium supports.
And before I do that, I actually also put heat shrink around the aluminium support so the edges aren't sharp. So if you actually hit it or butt up against it, all you hit is the heat shrink. So it's got heat shrink, it's quite a wide support area, much wider than a standard bike hook, which is usually just like two metal hooks covered in a bit of rubber. And then with the butyl tube wrapped around it, that normally is enough to protect the bikes, and I don't have any issue with my other bikes. So over here I've got my wife's bike hanging up on the wall, and that one is with just the butyl tubes. And as you can see, half the frame is painted, but we've not had any issues with that bike hanging there. And then I've got this one, which is my really old aluminium frame. It's maybe 16 years old now, or maybe even older than that. And the paint on that is like enamel. It's rock hard. It does chip if you hit it really hard. But again, no issue with that frame resting on those supports with the butyl tubes. No issue whatsoever. So these two metal frames, aluminium and titanium from two different companies, no problem. But this one, in order to prevent the tubing from actually getting damaged, or the paint on the tubing from getting damaged, I have to wrap it in an additional piece of pipe lagging. So this is insulation or pipe insulation, pipe lagging foam, and I have to put that on there first before I hang the bike. Otherwise, it gets damaged. And interestingly enough, I've actually done it for the other Cinelli bikes that I have, which are for sale. I've got a Pressure up here and a Superstar. And both of those, as you can see, have got the same supports, but with the butyl tube. And I've actually put a little bit of extra foam under each one as well to prevent any damage to the frame paint.
So, coming on to one of the biggest negatives of this bike is the weight. And that might sound ridiculous, but it's coupled with something else, which is the lack of comfort. So when I bought this bike, what I wanted was the steel frame bike that I already have, which is very, very heavy. It's like 3 kilograms for the frame. But I like the steel feel. I like the ride quality of steel, that springiness, that liveliness, the comfort. When you hit those bumps in the road, you just don't feel them, okay? Something that soaks up that vibration. This bike is 8.5 kg, which is not extraordinarily heavy, but it's rim brake. And if you went for the disc brake version, you'd probably be looking for more like 9.5 to 10. I know the Vigorelli, which is a slightly less high-end Cinelli frame, built up in disc brake, is around 10 kg, even with decent components on it. I was willing to sacrifice the weight for comfort and for that steel feel. This bike is not a steel bike. This bike is a carbon bike made of steel.
Sto lavorando sul progetto di un telaio in carbonio monoscocca e con delle geometrie particolari, quindi volevamo verificare queste geometrie e la cosa più semplice da fare era farlo con un telaio in acciaio.
So what you have is the ride comfort of carbon fiber, which is almost non-existent. You have the dead feeling of carbon fiber. You don't have the zinginess and springiness of a lively steel frame, like a traditional steel racing bike. You just don't have that with the Nemo, in my opinion. In comparison with older steel frames that I've ridden, thinner steel frames that I've ridden, because the tubes on this bike are incredibly wide. They're big, oversized tubes. And although they're very, very thin, that adds a huge amount of stiffness to the frame. It's much wider tubing. This Cinelli Spirit tubing, which is incredibly stiff tubing, light but stiff, it totally takes the flair, the zinginess, and a lot of the joy out of riding a steel bike. This feels like a heavy carbon bike to ride. And that is where I'm going to upset a lot of people. And it hurts me to say it. And it's been a total shock to me how stiff and aggressive this bike is, to the extent where when I finish riding, I sometimes feel a little sore. And I don't get that with my titanium bikes, and I don't get that with my other steel bike, no matter how far I ride. But this one, after even 60 kilometers, I start to feel it. This bike, with the carbon fork, which makes the front end very stiff, very uncomfortable, you get numb hands after a long ride because of that carbon fork, because there's just no bounce in that at all. With a steel fork, you get that vibration dampening. But even with the super stiff front fork and the super stiff frame, this bike just doesn't get up and go like you would expect it to. Once this thing gets up to speed, it flies wonderfully, but getting it there is tricky.
Time to ride. Okay folks, let's wrap things up by talking about who is this bike really for. So let's start off with racing. I'm going to play some footage in the background while I discuss whether this bike is suitable for somebody who intends to use it primarily for racing. Well, the short answer is no. I wouldn't recommend this bike for somebody who's looking for a race bike, simply because the Nemo is just too heavy to be good over varied terrain. As soon as you come up to some steep hills, you're really going to start to decelerate, and you will be at a climbing disadvantage. The same with undulating terrain as well. The bike just doesn't have the sharp acceleration that you need from a race bike. The same thing when you're coming to bridge gaps or close gaps within the group, or even chase down breakaways. The bike does roll very well once it gets up to speed, but it is those short, fast changes in acceleration where the Nemo is at a severe disadvantage. So I simply couldn't recommend it on that basis. As a potentially as a crit bike, because the handling of the Nemo is so good, you might be able to get away with it, but again you still come into the issue of the lack of top end sort of acceleration for the bike. And also the bike is very uncomfortable. I mean, I really do believe very strongly that a racing bike needs to be comfortable. You need to be comfortable and happy on the bike, because if you're not comfortable, you're not going to perform well. I tend to find that if I have a bike that is a nice fit for me and I don't feel tired on or fatigued on over long distances, I race much better on that bike, irrelevant of the weight or even the stiffness of the frame. Obviously you want a bike that's light and stiff for racing, but you also want a bike that feels comfortable, and unfortunately the Nemo just isn't comfortable enough to make it a suitable race bike as well, especially for stages races or Grand Fondos. Moving on to touring, again I can't really see this bike making a good touring bike because it's not very comfortable over long distance. There isn't really anywhere to fit panniers or mudguards to the bike. I believe you can get sort of pannier attachments or mudguards put on the frame, but you would really be ruining the aesthetic of the bike, and it is a very pretty bike. You'd be ruining the aesthetic by putting panniers on it or bags on it. And you also have to be concerned about that paint. That paint is not particularly very hard wearing, so you would end up doing significant damage to the paint on the frame. It is a steel bike, so it is going to be durable in general, and you're not going to damage it by putting heavy weights on it in the same way you would maybe a carbon bike, but I also discount it as a touring bike. It's just too aggressive. I also noticed from the handling of the bike, because the bike is a little bit unstable, which makes it great in the corners, but if you're touring over long distance doing a lot of straight lines, it can get a little bit tiring keeping the bike under control. So again, definitely not for touring. As a pure climbing bike, again, of course, it wouldn't be a sensible choice as a pure climber because of the weight, and also it just doesn't have the acceleration that you would need for, say, for example, climbing competitions. I don't think anyone would consider this bike as a climbing bike. I think most people who are really into climbing are picking very lightweight carbon fiber frames or potentially lightweight aluminium frames. So, yep, definitely not a climbing bike. And commuting, you could commute on this bike. It is very agile, so it makes it handy for nipping in and out of lanes of traffic. But would you be prepared to lock such an expensive bike up outside your workplace? Say you work in London or somewhere where there's a high percentage of bike theft and bike crime. I think you would be hard pressed to be comfortable chaining up such a pretty and expensive bike outside your workplace and expecting it to still be there when you got back. And also, I tend to find with my commuting bikes, I pick bikes which are a little bit cheaper and bikes that I don't mind damaging the frame, because as we wrap chains and things around the frame, even when the chains have got covers on, dirt and grit gets pressed into the frame and you end up damaging and scratching the frame. So I couldn't recommend it for that kind of usage, and I don't think anybody would use this as a commuting bike. It's simply too pretty for that, and too valuable as well. So moving on to what you could use this bike for, I've got a bit of an unusual one to start with, which is as a work of art. The Nemo Tig is a very pretty bike, and I think there are quite a few people out there who buy bikes as part of their hobby and just buy them to collect, really. And as a collector's item, or as a bike to hang on the wall at home and admire, the Nemo Tig is, well, it's really very well suited for that because it's so aesthetically pleasing. And you could use it one or two times. You could show it off to your your local group, and as I say, just hang it on the wall and enjoy it as what it is, which is really a very nice piece of artwork, if that's your thing. Another way you could use this bike is for social riding, maybe the Sunday ride or the coffee ride. I have a ride here in Brunei which I call the Sunday cake ride, where we do about 60 or 70 kilometers maximum, usually about 60 kilometers, with breakfast at the halfway point, and we also eat cake at the end. So as a Sunday cake ride bike, I think the Nemo Tig is really rather excellent because it's pretty, it's a conversation starter, and because it's not a ride where you will need to do lots of sprints or hard efforts. It's just sort of rolling with the group. The Nemo Tig is absolutely fine for that and will do very well. And because it's it's not terribly comfortable, but you're only doing relatively short distances on your Sunday rides with other riders, probably no more than 100 kilometers, not huge endurance rides of 200 or 300 kilometers usually. So yeah, I think as a Sunday ride bike or as a social ride bike, it's very suitable. And then finally, what I think I'll be using my Nemo mostly for is as a training bike. So for me, a training bike is something that is heavier than my race bike. It's still something which handles rather well because I need to train and I need to be able to do those corners and do those fast courses preparing for a race. But I want a bike that is basically less fast than my racing bike. And the Nemo is perfect for that. Once I build my racing bike back up, it's going to be a couple of kilograms lighter than the Nemo. And it's certainly a lot better at sprinting than the Nemo. So I think it's going to make a very good training bike. I have considered lightening the bike up, and I may do that at a later stage by fitting some extra pieces of carbon fiber and things to the frame, but maybe swapping out the seat post and handlebars for some lighter stuff just to lighten up the frame a little bit. But no matter what I do to the frame, it's definitely going to be heavier than my race bike. So as a training bike, the Nemo might be a good choice.
A steel race bike made of steel makes sense. A carbon race bike made of carbon makes sense. But a carbon bike made of steel doesn't make sense, and that's what the Nemo Tig is. Anyway, thanks for watching, folks. I'm going to leave you with this beautiful view. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more reviews. As always, folks, stay safe.